Greetings, Tyler. Thank you for being here today. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
We're here today to talk about your new book, Not for King or Country, Edward Cecil-Smith, the Communist Party of Canada, and the Spanish Civil War. Can you give just a brief overview of who Edward Cecil-Smith was, just for those who may not be familiar with his story?
Very understandable not to be familiar with his story, because it's an obscure time frame in Canadian scholarship, at least, and also this gentleman is obscure enough that he doesn't even have a Wikipedia page, which is sort of a new 21st century standard of how meritorious someone is. He is almost a Forrest Gump type character of the history of the Canadian left in the interwar period. He just pops up all over the place in different lines of operations, different kinds of activities, never necessarily right at the very top, but always involved. So I think that's a big part of the reason that there's not much written about him until my book, because if you were really interested in, say, leftist theater, he would pop up. If you're really interested in the Canadian missionary community on the left, social gospelers, he'd pop up. If you're interested in the Spanish Civil War, he pops up, but not necessarily with so much activity, so many events, so many newsworthy events, that if you didn't follow him from beginning to end, you would realize how involved he was in so many different things. Also, historians of the Spanish Civil War, of a military event, aren't necessarily always interested in leftist theater in downtown Toronto. So the vehicle of biography was pretty fun to follow him from his childhood as a son of British missionaries in China, coming to Canada in 1919, living a very prototypical WASPy life in middle-class Toronto, as being a banker, of being a militiaman, of marrying the secretary at his parents' missionary organization, to going very left-wing, joining the Communist Party, becoming a militant member of the newspapers, labor organizing, the left-wing theater, until finally, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, he goes apply his militia background and quickly becomes the commander of the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, where he fights the battalion through 2 years of war.
And Cecil-Smith was born in China and spent most of his youth there. How big of an impact was his upbringing in China to the development of his worldview later on in life?
I think it was absolutely critical to his worldview. I think if I could put my hands on a handful of things that really pulled him in the direction that he was pulled, politically at least, it was his childhood in China, the Depression, and the illegalization of the Communist Party of Canada. His childhood in China, I think, was very formative for him, because although the values that he came to hold with regards to communism did overlap with his parents' Christian beliefs in many ways through the social gospel movement, the key thing, I think, was his assessment of risk. When is it appropriate to take risk in the furtherance of your beliefs? His parents had been in China during the Boxer Rebellion, for instance, and his mother had nearly been killed by the Boxers. They evacuated to the coast. They came back. They were not dissuaded. They went right back to work. They had missionaries who worked for them that were kidnapped. One was actually taken on Mao's Long March, the 8th Route Army. They had a few that were killed. You can certainly talk at great length, and we should probably just put a pin in that, about the morality of the nature of missionary work in rural China at the time. But from this point of view, they were very devout, and they were willing to accept great personal risk to further their beliefs. They were not willing to sit in a pew back in England, where they grew up, and pray. They wanted to take their beliefs to the masses and accept the risk there. So I think Cecil-Smith was just imbued with that from a young age, that if you believe in something, then you need to accept the risk of that. And that manifested as both being a communist, which was illegal for much of the time that he was, accepting the risks of the police surveillance and the arrests, and then going to Spain, where he was volunteering to go fight in a war, and he might be killed and he might be wounded. And if he was wounded, there was no social safety net. There was not going to be anything resembling the treatment of the Great War veterans when they returned. He would just be on his own. But he accepted that.
Did his faith survive his conversion to communism?
Did, and that's really rare. That's really rare when you look at these characters. There are some Christian denominations that are more conducive to holding communist beliefs in your head at the same time. Catholicism tends to be the most anti-communist Christian denomination. Cecil-Smith was High Anglican, which is close. There were not a lot of practicing High Anglicans in the Communist Party of Canada at that time. He still went to church. He went to church until I think his family said until the 50s. At that point, he said, I've gone to enough church. I'm not learning enough. I will pray on my own time. But he was still a Christian throughout his time with the Communist Party, and he didn't shy away from addressing that. In fact, he got publicly gentle ribbing from leaders of the Communist Party. I'm sure behind closed doors he got sterner talking tos, but he managed to hold both sets of beliefs in his head. He did not feel that they were discordant at all.
How did he reconcile his Christianity with his communism?
Mostly be through the social gospel movement, the idea that that paradise, that heaven can be constructed on earth, that it's our objective as earthly beings to take care of one another, to build a community where everyone is taken care of. He often liked to quote the various passages from the Bible that said things about the ease with which a rich man can enter into heaven is about the same as a camel passing through the eye of a needle. I'm heavily paraphrasing, of course. And that property should be held in common, and we should take care of one another, and the various parables that Jesus told about taking care of one another and sharing what we have. For him, those things were primary, and there's lengthy debates you can have about all of those points, but he saw the holding property in common to be the same as Marx's abolition of bourgeois property, of the being my brother's keeper as all things held in common, and building a socialist society.
And he was as we just talked about, born in China, kind of raised in the British imperial tradition, serves in the Canadian militia. How does someone like that find communism?
There were a few events in his youth, but chief among them was at the time when the Great Depression started. Even before the Great Depression started, there was a fair crackdown by the new chief constable in Toronto, Denny Draper. Denny Draper was a very anti-communist man. He was a former brigadier in the Canadian Expeditionary Force. He was not a police officer, and but he was really brought in because he was so anti-communist, and he created red squads. He wasn't scared of using cavalry and motorcycle troops to break up Communist Party rallies. And Cecil-Smith was a journalist for the Mail and Empire at that time, and he covered a couple of those events. And you can see it in the tenor of his coverage, where even though that's the more right-center paper of the time, it sort of descends from being, this is important, this is rule of law, this is what should happen, to, I think the police are overstepping here. Cecil-Smith was also a courtroom reporter. He was called a police reporter because he would go to the police courts, the magistrates' courts. So that was low-level offenses. And he saw how a lot of immigrants, people whose second language was people who were English as a second language, how they were being treated, how certain people were being marginalized. And he met a gentleman named Oscar Ryan, who was in the back of the courtrooms. Oscar Ryan was very involved with the central leadership of the Communist Party, and he was the publicity director for the Canadian Labour Defence League. They hired lawyers. They hired lawyers for working class people when they were facing evictions or crimes related to speaking in a public hall that was not English. And Cecil-Smith saw something in that he really liked. From there, he started having these conversations. He was an avid reader, so he was no doubt already familiar with Marxism, but he got the ideas, and he also began to see the Communist Party as being a vehicle for realizing them. There's no way to tell really what was in his head, like how much he wanted pure revolution or how much he just wanted a better socialist society. That's hard to say. It's hard to graph throughout the course of his political career. But at first, it really was from the perspective that the British legal institutions that he really believed in weren't fulfilling their duties anymore. And here was the Communist Party, of all people, who were.
He's kind of a man of contradictions, isn't he? Not just a Christian communist, but he's also a pacifist who signs up to fight in the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s.
The pacifism point was I struggled with for a long time. And I think the simplest way to distill it is he distinguished between imperial war and his conceptions of just war. And he looked at the Great War as the First World War as not being a just war. He looked at it as being an imperialist war that was really fought between, on the Western Front, France, Britain, and Germany to establish economic and political dominance. He did not see that as he just saw that as the meat grinder. He just saw that as the suicide of capitalism. And from your own research in spiritualism and the troops of the First World War, there was this deep belief in the spiritual, and this sense after the war. The Second World War almost fixed the reputation of the First World War, but in the 20s and the 30s, there's a lot of despondency. It's easy to lose sight of that. We lose sight of that a lot and just sort of commemorate it. There's nothing wrong with that commemoration, but we lose sight of the fact that there were so many people that even participated in the war who thought that might not have been the best idea. He was one of those people. And yet, he volunteered to go to Spain, and he volunteered to go to the Second World War. And he actually went and fought in the Spanish Civil War. And that's because he saw those conflicts as being just. He saw fighting fascism in both Spain and against Germany as being a just and noble cause. And in those circumstances, you shoulder a rifle. But I have to admit, when I read those first passages about how he talked to veterans of the Great War and how he talked to people about the Great War, it was very shocking to me. It didn't seem like it did seem like a serious contradiction.
There's a bit of irony to that, since the war in Spain really does not go his way. Is he similarly disillusioned after the Spanish Civil War?
He is not at first. At first, he still thinks the Spanish Republic can win. He comes back in February 1939. It seems odd to me that he still believed that the Spanish Republic could rally. You just have to look at a map and see how little terrain they held and how little international support they had. But he thought they could win, or at least he said so publicly. But by April, when the Spanish Republic collapsed, he became very despondent, publicly and privately. He was distressed. Him and the other volunteers had sacrificed so much for this cause, but ultimately it didn't matter. What mattered was the interactions of nation states. The fact that Britain and France did not intervene on behalf of democracy in Spain, but Germany and Italy were willing to intervene on the side of fascism. He was also deeply concerned about what was coming next. As soon as he came back from Spain, he was writing about that this next war was coming. A war with Germany was just a few months away, and of course we now know that was completely correct. But he saw that as being completely inevitable. That Germany was fully emboldened, and that the democracies of the world were going to pay for their lack of intervention in Spain.
Now, the Spanish Civil War is kind of the forgotten war of the 20th century, but how significant was the conflict in Canada at the time? And how significant was Canada's contribution?
So just to start from the top to define our terms, let's talk about Canada as the state with policy, and Canada as in Canadians, the people who live here. Canada, the state, didn't want anything to do with the Spanish Civil War. Prime Minister Mackenzie King was adamant in public statements and private references in his diary. He didn't want Canada involved in the Spanish Civil War at all, and he actually managed to make Canada do less than nothing somehow. Canada was one of the few countries that actually did pass a specific law to prohibit Canadians going to fight in Spain. We could have just leaned on the British law, the British Foreign Enlistment Act, which was still good law in Canada, but we rewrote the law such that it absolutely applied to Spain and civil wars, and then made it apply to Spain by an express order in council. And then it was time to bring the volunteers back. Most countries, they paid to bring all their volunteers back. Yeah, even though they had not spent a dime to send them there, someone else did that. But the countries, Britain, France, everyone paid money to bring their people home. It was considered to be part of the international peace process, which obviously didn't pan out in favor of the Republic. Canada didn't spend any money on that. And I'm not saying they should, but it's notable that we were one of the only countries that said we will not spend a dime. And all those volunteers were brought back with private money and money from the Spanish Republic. We also didn't allow delegations from the Republic to visit Canada. There were a few in the first few months of the war, but after that, at the advice of Ernest Lapointe, Mackenzie King didn't allow subsequent Republican delegations even enter the country. So the state wanted as little to do with this conflict as they could possibly manage. And even though it was against the law, ultimately they didn't press charges. There were no trials against the volunteers because they didn't want it to become a news item again. They just wanted it to quietly fade away. Now, as far as the Canadian citizenry goes, that's pretty, I think it's a very interesting matter because we made a significant contribution, especially if you look at it on a per capita basis. So nearly 1,700 Canadians went to Spain. And if you think about it, that's kind of in line with the number of troops that the Canadian state sent to, say, any number of peacekeeping operations in the 1990s. It's not a small number. And then when you consider that A, it was illegal, and that B, on a per capita basis, this is rather extraordinary because that's 1,700 people drawn from our population of 10.95 million at the time. So you can't compare that ratio to Europeans, where it was really just a matter, like you could walk to Spain, and people did that, or you could hitch a ride to Spain. Canadians had to get all the way across the Atlantic. So really we should compare ourselves to the Americans, where the Communist Party had much more money to send people. But about 2,800 Americans went to Spain, which is about twice as many Canadians, but their population was more than 10 times our population. They had a population of 128.1 million at the time. So big ratios, a lot of interest, a lot of involvement. And then there was people like Norman Bethune, who ran one of the first mobile blood banks anywhere. He was a Canadian thoracic surgeon who went to Spain, and he did that for the Spanish Republic until he went to China, where he became even more famous.
Can his story help us understand the motivations of the thousands who enlisted?
I think so, because in many ways Cecil-Smith was representative. Mentioned he was a rarity in terms of journalism, intellectualism, etc. But he was similar to the majority of the Canadian volunteers in that he was a member of the Communist Party of Canada, or the Young Communist League. The vast majority of them were. And he wasn't born in Canada. The majority of the volunteers who left from Canada, the Canadian volunteers, they were immigrants of many recent immigrants from Eastern Europe, but many were not. Many were fully settled in Canada and had jobs. The other thing that I think is important, and I'm not sure how we will ever really know the answer to this, is marriage and employment. Because you sort of assume that whenever someone leaves their old life and goes overseas, and you see this in discussion about foreign fighters going to work with ISIS or whatever, you assume that these are ne'er-do-wells, that there are people who don't have a job, don't have much of a family, aren't tied down with any of those things. But that's not true. These people really, some of them definitely fall into that category, but a lot of them had jobs, had families. And the gravity of what was happening in Spain was enough to pull them. They had enough pull. The pull factors outweighed the anchor holding them back. And I think that's really important to understand. I think if I was to have written a book about an unemployed or unemployable person who didn't have a family and didn't really have any prospects, it wouldn't tell you as much about how deep the motivation to go to Spain was.
What was Cecil-Smith's war like?
He had a difficult run of it, as many of them did. He was identified early as having leadership potential, and he was initially used in training. However, by his first summer in Spain, he was a company commander. And this was the Battle of Brunete, one of the first offensives that the Spanish Republic was able to launch. And he was a company commander, had almost no training as a company commander. He had trained other company commanders, but he himself had not been put through the paces of any kind of collective training. And he was wounded on the very first day of the battle, which probably saved his life because the rest of the battle did not go particularly well. He took shrapnel to the knee, and allegedly exploding bullet shot him in the rifle, and was even odd because officers didn't carry a rifle in the international brigades. He just happened to pick up the rifle of a wounded soldier a moment earlier, and then he was shot in the rifle, which saved his life, but he got shrapnel into his arm. So that got him thrown back into the training system, and as he rehabilitated, he finally made it to the brand new Mackenzie Papineau Battalion, the nominally Canadian battalion. It wasn't ever a majority Canadian, but they gave it a Canadian name in recognition of the number of Canadians that were spread across the international brigades. He took over the battalion the following year, and his first real action was in 1938, where he commanded the battalion at the Battle of Teruel. So this is a really steep learning curve when there's no collective training, right? He'd done like tabletop exercises, and he thought through problems. He pushed map symbols around on the map. But he really had a couple of days of in-garrison training as a company commander, in-garrison experience as a company commander, a couple of days of operations, 1 day of battle. Then he was a battalion commander in a defensive operation. And then he led the battalion on a raid at the Battle of Atalaya. And then he was faced with probably one of the most difficult leadership challenges that a battalion commander could face, which was the 1938 Aragon Offensive. This was where Francisco Franco, with Italian troops, Italian tanks, German tanks, kind of gave a dry run to what Blitzkrieg in Western Europe was going to look like. Blitzkrieg in Poland and Western Europe was going to look like. He still used tanks in penny packets, but he didn't let them do deep operations. But Cecil-Smith and the whole of the international brigades was faced with this incredible onslaught of steel and cavalry. They were still using cavalry for offensive operations. And they didn't have enough anti-tank weapons, and they didn't have air power, and they really just kind of got annihilated. And this one's a fascinating study for motivation as well, because this period of time is called the retreats. Everyone refers to it as the retreats because they put up defensive actions where they could, but mostly they just ran and then got ambushed from behind by cavalry and ambushed from behind by tanks and tried to set up the next defensive position. We can go into more detail of this if you want, but Cecil-Smith was accused of cowardice in this incident during this battle, where he was separated from the battalion. But his battalion was no longer a battalion. It was spread out over kilometers and shattered. And this was a time period where they were executing and firing officers for dereliction of duty. So I sort of lean on he fell apart under extraordinary circumstances, but he also got himself back to a unit and then commanded on a limited offensive operation as soon as he could. So it's sort of a toss-up, but extraordinarily difficult circumstances.
And his story really kind of ends after the Second World War. What happens to him?
Just to cover a little bit of what he did during the Second World War, some of the literature just says that, and then the Second World War broke out and he stopped. He didn't stop. He was still involved. He came to a disagreement with the Communist Party. He wanted to fight for Canada. Specifically, he wanted to take the Mackenzie Papineau Battalion to Europe, which is a really interesting kind of counterfactual. You know, what if Canada had armed the veterans, the volunteers of the Spanish Civil War and sent them back to Europe? They could have been ready faster than any other battalion that could have been generated in Canada, certainly. Sort of like in the First World War, how the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry was able to get to Europe and into operations as quickly. They were more experienced people. And he wanted to go to Poland. So that's the counterfactual. What if the Canadian government had said, yes, let's send these people who left Canada illegally a year ago, let's arm them and send them to Poland? It boggles the mind if that had actually happened. And there were Polish Canadians in the unit, so they could have, they're there. Someone can take that as a piece of historical counterfactual fiction to run with. And he did some union work during the war. But at the end of the war, nothing at all. He got a job as a journalist in Toronto, and then he got another job in Montreal. I know that he applied for a government job, but during the war, but the RCMP said no. They wrote a letter explaining that he should not be entrusted with anything within the Canadian government. The RCMP had got him kicked out of the Canadian Army. He briefly served in the Canadian Army, but he didn't deploy, again, because the RCMP intervened. His commander seems to have liked him, though, because he got him a medical discharge. Cecil-Smith only got into the Army because he had Coke bottle glasses. He was virtually blind, and he had to memorize the eye chart in order to pass the test on the second try. So he had that baggage. Like, he knew he was known to the RCMP, and right after the war, the Gazenko affair and all of that may have played a role. He had a child during the war. Him and his wife had their son Bill in 1942. So it could have been just, you know what, this isn't worth it anymore. I'm sufficiently disenchanted with the Communist Party, both because of its internal inconsistencies and its flip-flopping on the war and just the politics of it all, but also the coercion of, I don't want to go to jail. I have a family now. I have a job. I'm lucky to have a job, given his political history. And then of course the Cold War, which was more than enough for a lot of communists to hang up their spurs. But it came to a screeching halt. He was really active, really interested, really involved, really willing to put his life on the line. And then nothing. He maintained left-wing politics, according to his son. He was still interested in those kinds of things. He still read the Canadian Tribune, but no labor organizing, no radical writing, no plays, no nothing. The other simplest explanation is that by the time we hit the 1950s, there was less interest in revolution. You know, the Depression was a time when it was a straightforward process to be angry with the status quo, thinking there was a better way, with being disenchanted with things. In the 1950s, he was able to buy a house and a car. Things were going pretty good. So that might be the simplest explanation of the de-radicalization of Cecil-Smith: prosperity.
Well, I think that is as good a point as any to end our conversation. Tyler, thank you so much for joining me today. Again, the book is Not for King or Country: Edward Cecil-Smith, the Communist Party of Canada and the Spanish Civil War. It's a fascinating read, touches on a lot of different topics that will interest a lot of people. European history, the Spanish Civil War, warfare in the 20th century, Canadian politics, labor politics. It really does have it all. And I think that's the term untold story or forgotten history gets thrown around a little too liberally these days, but in this case, I think it is entirely appropriate. Fascinating story. Thanks again, Tyler.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.